More now on the upcoming 2022 IRMSA risk report. And I'm in conversation now with Colin Deiner, who is the Chief Director, Western Cape Government Disaster Management and Rescue. Colin, a very warm welcome to you and a very important job that you hold in the Western Cape. Maybe just as an overview, the local and if you want to touch on the global risk landscape, what is your view in terms of the way it's changed in the past year or so? It certainly has been dramatic, hasn't it?
Hi, Jeremy. Yes, I think it actually has a lot of things. I think obviously the global COVID-19 pandemic is not only from its own and the nature of the pandemic itself, but just all the knock-on effects. I think it's really changed the global sort of risk profile. And obviously, speaking for South Africa, which I'm very closely involved in, I think we've seen so many other things happen, so many knock-on effects taking place, which has increased the risk, so much more. So just maybe if I can touch on a few areas that I think we've seen. I think the first and the biggest problem that I'm seeing, and the biggest challenge that I'm seeing, is we have seen obviously it's poverty driven, and it was because of the start, I think, where we saw a lot of poverty. We've seen an exponential increase in informal settlements, in people moving to cities, trying to get closer to jobs. And although that's something that I suppose has existed for years and years, what we are seeing now is that specifically because of the pandemic and the fact that people were not allowed to be evicted, not that I'm saying that that was a good thing in the first place, but we saw expansion into a lot of areas where normally you would not have seen that. There would have been some sort of control. But what we've seen is expansion, onto railway lines, onto electricity servitudes, very close to high-risk areas, next to manufacturing plants that should have, safe areas around them. So you've just seen this exponential amount of people moving into high-risk areas. And I think that for me has become probably one of the biggest risks that we're facing.
So let's look at that if we can, Colin. The poverty quotient has changed dramatically, not only in the Western Cape where you operate from, but around the country. It's very pronounced. How then has that changed the dynamics of your job with a specific reference to managing risk?
Okay, so what you would generally see, I mean, city planning and town planning is exactly that. It's looking at placing specific industry and specific services in places where they could be fairly well protected, where they're able to operate. What you're seeing now is you're seeing people moving into those kind of areas. So let me take, for example, where you have an electricity situation and you have power lines and you have people moving underneath those power lines. So you basically have two types of risks, or two main groups of risks starting there. Firstly, you have people at very high risk sitting underneath an electricity power line. I'm talking about main lines. You also have the fact not only that there's a fire risk, there's a substantial health risk to the people living there. If something were to go wrong, if we were to see a pylon collapse, or we to see an informal settlement fire, for example, underneath that. But then you're also looking at a risk to the electricity supply. And already we have massive pressure as far as that is concerned. So an incident underneath a major power line, I'm only using that as one of the examples, could have a knock-on impact on the supply to a specific area. If that is close to industrial area, if it's close to a sensitive kind of area in terms of maintaining life or supporting life, supporting functions, for example, you have a problem then on the other side of it. For example, that I think would be is really a major challenge.
So how do you plan for that, and how do you communicate that to the people that are working for you? But perhaps more importantly, Colin, in your particular remit, how do you articulate that to the people that you're serving?
Yes, I think there's a lot of challenges. You can't just take the hardline challenge of saying that, there's a law preventing you from doing that, because there's so many other dynamics that have come into that over the time. People have for a long period now been allowed to do that because of the fact that there's been a lockdown, and People have tried to move away from very dense areas. So that has been allowed. So I think on the one side, there's a lot of awareness that needs to happen. There's a lot of education that needs to happen for people to understand what the situation is. And I know that a lot of people think that awareness and education doesn't always work, and maybe not to the effect that it should work. But I think it is very important to bring that to a person's attention. I think if you start taking it to a person and letting them understand that this could actually happen to me. I'm right here, and I can internalize what the problem is because I'm right there. I think that's the kind of direction you need to take from an awareness perspective. I think also from a planning perspective, we really need to look at making use of technology. You really have to try and zero in on exactly where the problem is and try and do your planning around that. And that's not always easy. It's a problem that gets bigger every day. So we have to continuously look at other ways of addressing it.
It's also predicated, isn't it, on having a different approach to risk among your staff. How do you deal with that internally?
Yeah, I think what's really important with how we manage risk nowadays, how we manage disaster risk and potential disaster risk, is to get a lot more on the ground, to focus a lot more, not just on what are the risks, but where can the risks happen and what would the impact of that risk be if it did happen. So one of the things that we deal with quite a lot in the Western Cape is what we call the wildland-urban interface. So you're aware that we have significant wildfires every year. What we're seeing more and more is obviously with this expansion, and it's informal settlements, but formal housing as well, into the kind of what we call the wildland kind of environment. You start seeing a much bigger risk to the wildland environment from the urban, the informal settlements or the housing or whatever, with fires starting there. Or then again, you can see a wildfire going into an urban environment like we saw in Knysna in 2017. So, what you need to do is make use a lot more of technology such as geographic information systems, such as disaster modeling, which is obviously something that we've put a lot of effort into, making use of things like drones, etc. And then actually, when you want somebody to evacuate an area, for example, or you want somebody to move away from an area, you've got to be very careful when you do that, because if you are convincing people to do something specifically and that disaster does not happen, or it doesn't happen in that area, you're going to lose a lot of confidence with people. So it's obvious that we need to look at being very much more precise and being able to have people internalize much more what could happen to them. So that's the kind of mindset that you need to have.
Colin Deiner, one of the other big risks that's identified in the 2022 report is, and I quote, unmanageable societal unrest and a breakdown of the rule of law. Your job obviously isn't law enforcement, but if there is a breakdown in the rule of law, that increases the way in which you deal with and approach risk, surely.
Absolutely. I think, we always talk about disaster management looking at the safety side and law enforcement looking at the security side. But I think it's those knock-on effects. So I can give an example of an incident that we dealt with a while back, where there was a breakdown of law in a specific area, but because of the unrest, and I think that probably happened quite a bit earlier this year as well, because of the unrest, you get the knock-on in the sense that one area would be your clinics, for example. So the clinics are not able to operate. People are not able to go to clinics to receive medication. You can't get cleaning services in to a specific area to do whatever it is that they need to do, cleaning doing refuse removal, possibly other cleaning activities. And that means that from a disaster management perspective, you now sit with two more problems. You sit with a lot of people that are now affected from a health perspective, and you need to look at how you're going to manage that. And you also look at the possibility that you now have a public health problem that is breaking out in terms of the fact that services are not able to be delivered. So then it really just snowballs into a whole lot of other things. So certainly that does have a huge effect. The other issue as well is fires start breaking out. We have a lot of arson when these kind of things happen. Your emergency services need to respond. Generally, although we've done quite a bit of work over the years in terms of making them more resilient, your emergency services are generally not trained to go into a conflict kind of situation. So then you have a larger fire loss, and you would have possibly even a larger life loss and property loss because of that. So that's really where, the risk really snowballs for us.
Colin, one of the issues that faces any risk management, and I imagine more so in your world, is balancing empathy with the people that you're dealing with, but also having to take hard-nosed decisions which are responsible, but are nonetheless unpalatable for some people.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's really difficult in a situation where you have, because you're always going to have children, poorer people, etc., and involved. They're generally the most vulnerable. They're not always in a position to be able to protect themselves to that extent. So it is difficult. Sometimes you don't have time to explain the reason for why you are doing a specific thing, like evacuating an area, like stopping people from entering into a specific a zone because of the fact that there's a safety issue, and even from looking at evicting people, which we obviously don't do often, but it is something that is sometimes necessary. And it's really, but I think at the end of the day, you've got to look at what the objectives are of what you're trying to achieve in the disaster. And your first objective would always be the protection and saving of lives. So if that is your objective, I think you can pretty much substantiate the decisions that you need to make. It's, as I said, it's not always easy, but it's the first thing we always do when we start the management of a disaster is we look at what our objectives is and try to stay with that.
Just a final question then. How are you going to factor in the so-called known unknowns of COVID-19 and the new variant and possibly others to come, 2022 and beyond? It's difficult, isn't it?
It is, but I think one of the things that has happened since we activated our COVID response system. So when we had the first wave and everything started last year, we identified a whole range. We work on what we call a cluster approach. So what we did is we identified 11 or 12 clusters. We always do this. We did it with the drought of 2017-18. So we identify the specific groupings, such as humanitarian aid, such as safety and security, education. So there's a whole range of these that we identify. We identify leaders, and then they form part of the whole disaster response system. And since we did that, we have dealt with a number of other disasters. We had some fairly large fires earlier this year. We've had a number of large flooding incidents just very recently, and then earlier in the season as well. We've dealt with a couple of unrest situations. So there's been a lot of a very large avian influenza outbreak. So we've been able to manage a lot of other incidents while at the same time responding to the COVID-19 disaster. So I think, if anything, it has taught us to work in this environment and to be able to manage within this environment, understanding that we've had to adapt, for example, our firefighting response with our aircraft much differently, because you need to place people in a very close environment while this pandemic is going on. You can't not put them in that environment. You have to have them move to a specific area. You're going to have 12 people very close to each other. So we've written different standard operating procedures. We've had to change a lot of the way we do things. But I think we have, because we've been active for such a long period of time, I think it's actually worked in our favor for the future.
And that's where we are going to leave it. Colin Deiner, Chief Director, Western Cape Government Disaster Management and Rescue. Thank you very much for joining us. And of course, this conversation feeding into that all-important 2022 Institute of Risk Management South Africa Risk Report. Colin, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thanks.